Hello and welcome to our first and hopefully last virtual version of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy for fall 2025. When last we met, we were looking at our good dead friend Empedocles, who is one of the pluralists, and what makes a pluralist, of course, is that they believe in a plurality of things, or did, because Empedocles is very, very dead, as opposed to people who are monists, such as our good dead friend Thales and Heraclitus, in the case of Thales, believing everything to be ultimately water. In the case of Heraclitus, fire, or perhaps more accurately, the logos. In the case of Empedocles, as we saw, his view is that the world is made up of more than one thing. And of course, to have more than one thing, you've got to have some principle that individuates things, that separates them. And his principle of individuation, which explains why there are distinct things, is strife, and he thinks that's what brings about individuation. And as we saw previously, what brings about unity is love. Now, of course, there's an interesting question about whether he thought this was like actual emotions, or these are simply like names of forces corresponding to things like human emotions. And an interesting question that will arise later when we talk about looking at medieval philosophy, the question of God. Like when people talk about that God loves, what does that mean? Is it that God has the same feels that we do when we feel love for somebody else? Or is it something else? and not surprisingly, people who do theology and philosophy differ on that answer. But getting back to our good dead friend Empedocles. So he does take the view that we saw last time, that the world is heading towards strife, and the view that things are becoming worse. And as I mentioned previously, this is a common theme in views about the world, talking about how the past was better. And there's often the view that, there was a great past and things are bad now, and we can go back to a time that was much better. For example, Confucius, in his view, he talks about an age of sages in which things were, good. And what we have to do, according to Confucius, was go back to that wisdom. We also see this in political movements. For example, in the United States, we have MAGA, Make America Great Again, which takes a view that things are bad now, but were once great. And then the question is, when was the great time and how do you get back to it? Now, Empedocles takes the view of that things are becoming worse. So the past was better, but the future is always going to be worse on his view. In terms of how things work, he does bring in deities and gods. Again, there's always a question of what does that mean? What is the conception of that? And there are also material forces that, to quote him in English, of course, that run through all things like quicksilver. And the question, of course, is, how does that work exactly? Now, moving on to our more of our good dead friend Empedocles. There's also, as we saw before, the question of empty space. When we talked about our good dead friend Parmenides, a dead philosopher, not a cheese, he denies that there's empty space, because empty space would be nothing, and he argues logically that there can be nothing. Or rather, there can't be nothing. Again, it gets kind of confusing. And so he simply embraces kind of the idea that motion is one material object moving through others, and this gives rise to the usual question of how would that work? Because we often think conceptually to move into an area like a space, like in a game, you got to have an empty space there because you can't move something into something, because it's solid. And the options are kind of like, well, if you have empty space and things move into it, but then emptiness would be nothing, so there'd be no space, so that can't work. Or if you have objects moving into objects, they're solid objects, can't do that. So it's a question of what is, it's a game of what's the least bad. There's no good answer, one might say. There's just degrees of bad. And Empedocles seemed to have decided that the least bad option is we got to have motion. He presumably accepts we can't have empty space. He takes that view, much like Parmenides. And so motion is just going to be material objects moving through others. That somehow that happens. He also developed an early conception of sense perception, and this, it's always risky to sort of read back onto ancient thinkers like our modern theories, like he had a conception of photons and, nerves and parts of the brain, etc. But we do see here the beginnings of that idea that, as he saw it, perception occurs when you have stuff coming off the objects, striking the sense organs. And the general idea is obviously still kind of right. Yeah, as I mentioned before, the way we now believe that perception works is that in the case of visual perception, that photons, which obviously Empedocles didn't know about, bounce off objects and go into our eyes, triggering our optic nerve, resulting in visual perceptions. Or when we smell something, it's tiny particles get up into our noses and trigger our response. Or when we taste something, that we eat something and the little particles strike the taste buds in our tongue. And so the general idea seems to be basically right. Now, he also came up with an early theory of evolution. As I mentioned on many occasions, it's often believed that Darwin was the first guy to come up with evolution. And although Darwin obviously deserves credit for laying out the empirical argument and writing a huge book about it, the idea of evolution has been around for a long time, going back to the ancient Greek thinkers. And on Empedocles' view, this is how it works. So you have creatures that are produced randomly. So this would be like in the modern theory of evolution, you have random recombination of DNA. But obviously Empedocles had no idea about DNA. But the idea would be is that in a way it's kind of like a random creature generation. You just get all these random creatures, and the ones that would succeed would keep on going, and then the ones that failed would die off. And so the idea is that answering the question, why do things seem to fit their environment, his answer is, well, the ones that don't fit would just die. They just wouldn't make it. Later philosophers before Darwin also came up with examples like David Hume. If you take the modern philosophy class, he notes things like, well, if, for example, if fish, well, the example I use is, if, why do fish seem so well adapted to water? Well, if you had things, that were in the water that couldn't breathe water, they would obviously just die or couldn't swim. I mean, kind of a silly example, but they would perish. So if something can't survive in a place, it's going to perish. And so something that can survive will seem obviously able to survive and will seem to fit, because otherwise it would be dead. So theory of evolution, pretty old, but Darwin still deserves, quite a bit of credit because, again, he wrote that big book, gets lots of empirical evidence, develops the idea of this mechanism. But the idea that the universe is just kind of random is ancient. In fact, one might even say it's traditional. It's an old tradition, as is the tradition that the universe is intelligently created. It's an ancient debate. Now, another pluralist is Anaxagoras. There's a lot of, a lot of names that sound the same. Born 500 BC, died 428 BC, still dead today. He was born in Iona, moved to the city of Athens, and Athens was a kind of a great power through, well, sometimes, then eventually got defeated. And the sort of leading political intellectual circle at the time was Pericles, famous guy. Eventually, Anaxagoras got exiled from Athens, and the reason for this was he taught that the sun is a white hot stone and not a god. Now, of course, we know the sun is not like a rock, but again, it's the idea that the sun is not a deity, but a physical phenomena, and he got exiled for that. Also, in a somewhat famous story, a soothsayer, someone who basically predicts the future, claimed that a one-horned ram given to Pericles would guarantee victory in battle. And as you can see, another reason why he was probably kicked out is that he dissected that ram and showed that there was nothing special about it aside from the fact that it had a brain tumor that caused the missing horn. And so, an interesting fellow. So what were his views? Well, his claim is that every kind of thing has its own elements or seeds. And he's a pluralist because there's literally an element for every kind. So lots of elements. So clearly a pluralist. And he also claims that everything is mixed with everything. So if everything is mixed with everything, why is the thing that it is? And his answer is essentially that a thing is the thing that it is because it has, more of one category of element in it. That'd be like its dominant quality. To use a bit of a metaphor, if you think of like the color of like a paint, it's kind of like the color it is would be whatever it has the most color of, to use kind of a bad metaphor. So like what would make varying shades of, say, green would be that they all have, they're mostly green, and they have kind of other colors mixed in to give varying shades. As an example, he claims that, to illustrate like how this works, that how is it that if you eat like a hamburger or tofu, how does that become, you? Now today, of course, we know about like how like our body breaks it down to its elemental, to its compounds like amino acids, and then our body like restructures it. We tear it down to raw materials and rebuild it. Before this theory, of course, they'd have like another explanation. And his claim was that within food, there's already, the seeds, the bits of flesh, blood, bone, hair, etc. On one hand, it seems, you might think, well, that's kind of silly. How can there be like seeds of flesh, blood, bone, and hair in there? Or it might also seem kind of gross that when you're eating, tofu, that somehow there's, flesh, blood, bones, and hair in there, which would probably be clearly horrifying to vegans. Now, if we're actually, to be a bit gross, if we're eating, meat, there's already flesh, blood, bone, and hair in there. If you're eating hamburger, you're definitely getting flesh. There's clearly blood in there, and there's probably a bit of bone, and I would not be surprised that there being hair, at least some in there. So that can make some sense. So you might think of this as, it does make some kind of sense because the modern theory is very similar, that we have the building blocks in there. Now, again, it's always, risky to read back from today's, what we know today, to the past and take something, he said that food already contains the seeds in them, that, surely he meant what we mean now, but probably didn't. But an interesting view. In the case of, how do cows like produce milk, or does it apply to anything? Like how does anything become anything? And he claims that grass already contains the seeds of milk in there. And again, an interesting view. And we, of course, have to consider that even though today we'd say, perhaps he's talking about, it has like amino acids and so forth in there and carbohydrates. I clearly didn't know about amino acids and carbohydrates, but it's an interesting explanation that within each thing are the bits, the building blocks that make up stuff. He also introduced a concept that becomes very important later, and also the name of a reputable, I think it's still a reputable journal, always good to check, called Nous, which I always horribly mispronounce. They mispronounce everything. Translation kind of roughly is mind. So this mind, he claimed, is a source of motion and the principle of order. So you've got going back to the kind of question of, does stuff just happen or does things happen for a reason? Here we could say that there does seem to be some things happening for a reason, because you have a source of motion, the principle of order, that he talks about as being mind. Now, there's always, of course, the problem of, as I say over and over again, reading back from like what we mean by mind to what he might have meant by mind. So we may tend to think, a mind is, a mind like ours, a person who thinks and feels, etc. But as we'll see in the future, then philosophers, and especially in the case of God, there is a question of what that means. Like, what is it for something to be a mind? And our most natural view is to think of it as being, just like us, or maybe like us, but more powerful. But it could be something radically different. If you take the modern class, you'll see Spinoza. God has or is mind, but he doesn't feel, and in a way he kind of doesn't think for various strange metaphysical reasons. Now, in terms of the creation of the world, he doesn't, or didn't because he's dead, think that the mind created the world. But he believed that the mind is free, spontaneous, active, and all-knowing. And there's, of course, the question of what it means to be all-knowing. This will become a thing, much more so when we talk about getting at philosophers of the Middle Ages, talking about omniscience. Like, what is it to know everything? What does that mean? Does it mean you can know anything that can be known? And then there's a question of what can be known. Or could you know literally everything, even seemingly impossible things? There's also a comparable problem with being, all-powerful or omnipotent. What does it mean to be all-powerful? What does it mean you can do anything that's possible? And what does it mean to be possible? Now, there's the usual view that the mind, in many philosophies, people often tend to embrace a form of dualism, where you have mind as ghosty stuff or material stuff, and then you have the world being material. And Anaxagoras, again, horrible pronunciations, seem to take it to be a form of rarefied matter. So it's not incorporeal, ghosty soul stuff, it's more matter. Later, the modern philosopher Hobbes takes a similar view of God. Hobbes is, or was because he's super dead, a materialist, so everything that is material. But he didn't seem to want to go full atheist, so he said, perhaps God exists, but he seems to, take the view that God is a material God. But he kind of pushes aside the question of God, leaving it mostly for, essentially says it's something for a priest to talk about, essentially. But Anaxagoras seems to have taken it to be a form of matter. So why was he important? Well, although he did a lot of stuff, he did not end up creating a fully unified count of reality. And so other people, built on that. And a lot of philosophy is looking back at, predecessor and saying, well, look what they did and what did they get wrong? Let's work on that. He also had pretty extreme pluralism. Yeah, as I said, everything is its own category. He went from, the earlier philosophers who have one thing like water, or four things like earth, air, fire, water, to, everything is its own thing. And critics have said that this extreme pluralism, that everything is its own thing, lacks explanatory value. Roughly put, you might say there's too many categories. And so explanations are supposed to simplify and unify, and he seems to have said, it did say there's lots and lots, everything is its own category. Now, to be fair and balanced, it could be, a bias to say that we need to have a simple explanation. We have to have few things. And again, as we've gone along, we've seen kind of a bias or an assumption that there needs to be, say, one thing or a few things that explain everything, that there must be something to explain the many that you reduce down. The monist said it all reduces down to one thing. The pluralists say to many things. But the idea is there seems to be a bias in favor of the many must be explained by the few, which again could be a mere bias. Now, when he brings up the mind, this leads to the question of whether matter would be sufficient or not. Can you have matter just doing everything? In which case, people who say would embrace materialism or physicalism, depending on how you want to name it, and those who think you need more stuff. Most famously, of course, the dualists, like our good dead friend Descartes. Now, he also employed mind as what in the philosophy biz and also the art biz as a deus ex. You might have, if you've done any theater stuff or artsy stuff, you might have heard of Deus Ex Machina. Also, of course, the video game Deus Ex. Older video game, but thanks to companies like Good Old Games, and I think it's still on Steam. You can still get these old games, and they're often playable, but not always. So always check. Now, in theater, the Deus Ex Machina is essentially God's. The literal translation would be God in the machine, and in theater, the Deus Ex is used to resolve the plot, the complications, just literally by a divine, action. And it's generally seen as being a bad thing. So if a critic says, this plot is resolved by, Deus Ex Machina, they're almost certainly being critical, saying that it wasn't resolved in a satisfactory way. It's just that everything is kind of like fixed magically. Like the gods just show up and fix it. Or they wake up and it's all just a dream. Problem solved because none of it was real. Now, in the context of philosophy, the deus ex, in this case, is to use a god, or in this case, the mind, to fill gaps in the theory. So whenever there's a failure in the explanatory power of the theory, it's basically the mind gets put in there. Like if you can't explain why this happens, you just say, mind does it. Good example of this, and from the future relative to where we are in the class now, is planetary motion. And so one of the theories about the solar system, the classic one, of course, is that the Earth is the center of the solar system, and everything revolves around it. And the obvious problem with that, with observations, is if we're the center of the solar system and stuff's revolving around us, it should go around kind of like nice smooth pattern. But making observations of things, the other planets going around, they do seem to do weird things. That if you think the Earth is the center, there's weird results. And so people had to explain, like, how does this work? And the answer essentially was, to use what they call God in the gaps. Why does it do that? God. And if you couldn't explain something, you'd use like this divine spackle to explain it. So if you have a mystery and cannot solve it, check out God, he'll resolve it. And so what philosophers started doing, because of the principle of Occam's razor, and of course it's not very satisfying to just say, God just takes care of that nonsense. We have no good explanation beyond like divine spackle. Philosophers and scientists wanted to have less and less of that, even ones who believed in God, because again, it was kind of awkward to say like, yeah, the universe is all, really weirdly and badly designed, and God's got to be constantly tinkering with it. And so even people who believe in God wanted to say, oh no, let's make it work let's look at these theories to work as smoothly as possible. And so one thing that making the sun the center of the solar system did was solve a lot of those problems. And so you wouldn't need God to explain like how all that stuff worked. You would just say, got the sun in the center, planets going around it, problem solved. And again, even philosophers and scientists believed in God try to not use God in their theory unless they had to. But they often would just do so to solve problems. Even, for example, Sir Isaac Newton was known for doing this. And so in the future, if you happen to take the modern class, you'll see a lot of God in the gaps. Now, after our good dead friends, the pluralists, we also have the rise of our good dead friend, Democritus, and the atomists. So on to our good dead friends, the atomists. Now, the first atomist is Leucippus, whose name I'm no doubt horribly pronouncing, but who knows? I mean, he's super Greek, super dead, so the pronunciation is probably not super known. So he was the founder of this atomist movement, and beyond his name in founding it, very little is known about him. And so the best known atomist is Democritus. He was born around 460 BC, died in 360 BC, and is of course still dead today. As I mentioned before, a lot of the ancient philosophers didn't just do what we think of as being like philosophy today, because back in the day, a person could credibly claim to be an expert on many subjects, because we were still, writing the books on those subjects. So he wrote about history, mathematics, epistemology, which is a theory of knowledge, metaphysics, the nature and structure of reality, if it has such things, ethics, and more history. So he wrote about a lot of stuff. Now, he's an atomist, so shockingly enough, he thinks that reality consists of primarily atoms. So doing his metaphysics, we would have reality consisting of atoms, hence the atomist part, and also what he calls the void. Now, in a, sort of a refutation of Parmenides, they accept the void. So the void is both nothing, but also part of their ontology. So, a bit of a paradox there. And this is, in a way, kind of how Parmenides argued it, because if nothing is nothing, which it is, it would seem that it's, nothing. But they do take the void to be nothing, but also part of their ontology, which shows a problem of language, because nothing is obviously nothing, which leads to all kinds of problems, like if it's nothing, that can have no distance, etc., blah, blah, blah. So it's basically a problem of language. So the void is nothing, but also, I guess, real? But anyways, very confusing. But in a way, it does kind of make sense, because we do, before we get corrupted by like philosophy and physics, we do tend to think of space as like an empty box, and which we put stuff. But anyways, back to the atoms. We'll forget about the void for a while. So the atoms have the following qualities. One is they're indivisible, as I've been going on and on and on and on about. I always use a thing about, imagine if you had a sword that could cut anything that could be cut. How far could you cut? Could you cut forever? And Parmenides and Zeno, you're talking about, like, if you could divide things infinitely, that leads to some logical problems. So if you take an object and you can cut it into infinite pieces, then each piece has some size. Even a tiny number greater than 0 times infinity would be infinite. So that would mean, as they argued, any object would be infinite in size. And that leads to all kinds of absurdities. Similarly, with trying to travel a distance, if distance is infinitely divisible, that would mean there'd be, if it goes down to more than 0, infinity times any number that's bigger than 0 would be infinity. So you would take, everything would be infinite distance. So the way Democritus kind of solves this problem is, if you could cut forever until you hit the atoms, they cannot be cut. They're indivisible. So the smallest thing for Democritus was the atom. And if you're wondering, that's where we get our modern term for atom. He wasn't, but again, going from like what we talk about today to the past is always risky business. And so he didn't mean things like electrons, protons, and neutrons. It's that later scientists said, oh, Democritus is pretty cool. He talked about the atoms. Let's call these things atoms, yay, Democritus. So they cannot be sliced. They are eternal, which means they have always been and always shall be, and they never change. The atoms themselves don't change. How many are there? His answer is infinite. Now, what do the differences in the world arise from? Well, instead of having, even though there's one basic thing, type of thing, atoms, they do differ in size and shape. So the atoms are different sizes, they're bigger and smaller, and they differ in shape. And these shapes give them their different qualities. He did reason that they actually themselves have no color, they have no taste, temperature, or smell. These qualities are not qualities of the atoms. How do we experience them? Well, they arise from the combinations. Now, this kind of foreshadows the future, because a later thinker, if you take the modern philosophy class, Galileo Galilei, comes up with the notion of primary and secondary qualities. There are the qualities that are really out there in the world, the physical qualities, and like, for example, size, mass, density, volume. And then there are qualities that are in our mind, how we respond to these primary qualities. Things like color, flavor, warmth, cold, etc., or in odors. So we see here, not surprisingly, beginnings of what we start recognizing as modern, physics. But again, we don't want to, fall into the trap of reading back from what we believe about atoms today back to Democritus. So how does change occur? That's been, kind of an ongoing problem in looking at these philosophers and thinkers who had one type of thing, like water or fire. The question is like, how does water become things that don't seem to be water? And Democritus has got a pretty good system here. So you've got the atoms as like little building blocks. If you want, a good metaphor would be like Legos. The atoms are like Legos. They break down to this, you could like take a hammer to Legos if someone's like a Lego psychopath, but you break them down to the smallest blocks, and the blocks are different sizes and different colors, and you can put them together in different ways. And so for Democritus, the way change comes about is different relationships between the atoms. They like connect together. And again, I'm using the metaphor of Legos. In this case, he obviously didn't think of them as being like Legos. Now, in the universe, he believed that the universe itself was such that it has no absolute up or down. Because he thinks that would make no sense. So motion is without direction. It doesn't go up, doesn't go down because there's no up or down. So atoms, he claims, do not have any weight in the absolute sense. And they lack a natural resting point, so their motion is eternal. Now, later thinkers, of course, again, it's always risky reading back on from what we believe today to what people said in the past. But there's kind of a similar idea today that, we believe now the Earth is just in space and we are moving at a relatively high relative speed. And so what he envisions is these atoms just in the void. And they're not falling because there's no down. They're not flying because there's no up. They're just moving. And they're moving forever. Now, Aristotle was critical of Democritus because Democritus didn't, at least as far as Aristotle is concerned, didn't explain how motion gets going. And Aristotle later argues for his own view of how this works when he comes up with something we'll see in the future, the unmoved mover, which later gets developed into by St. Thomas Aquinas into an argument for God, the way of motion. So what about the world we live in? Because we live in a world of, colors and smells and warmth and cold and so forth. I mean, we do, of course, take temperature with our instruments. We do measure stuff with our, instruments, but we experience a world of, quality more than quantity. We feel, warmth. We don't have a digital thermometer in us that tells us it's exactly 72 degrees. We, taste things and have and smell things. So how does a world of appearance work? Well, according to Democritus, the motion and shapes of the atoms produce interactions. And these interactions and combinations give us the qualities of sense experience. And again, this is the kind of the laying the groundwork for what later, centuries later, becomes the idea of primary and secondary qualities. Primary being the qualities that are really out there, the secondary being the qualities we experience. So solid matter, he claims, would be produced by hooked or rough atoms because they, hook together. And so they wouldn't, pull apart. And you can, one way to think of this, of course, is think of objects you can see, like Velcro, stuck together. And it's obviously you can tear Velcro apart. Like you could, if you're strong enough, you tear like something, like break a pencil in half or something. And so solid matter is those things like hooked together, connected together. Liquid would be smooth atoms, so they would go down smooth. Sweet things would also be smooth. Bitter things would be sharp because they would like poke your tongue atoms. And so his claim is essentially he's working out kind of this first theory of, why do things like taste the way they do, and his explanation is essentially shapes of atoms. Now, of course, that turned out to be like, in a sense, incorrect, but later we, of course, came to believe that it's made up of the chemical makeup and their interaction with our senses. Now, in terms of like, is there purpose or not purpose? His answer essentially is no purpose. There's no ordering principle or purpose or intelligence beyond the properties of the atoms and the random collisions from their motion. We're just atoms swerving in the void. So if he was driving a car, if he wasn't dead and driving a car, his bumper sticker would be the stuff just happens, atoms in the void. So to head into the home stretch, what about his epistemology, his theory of knowledge? So he does develop a theory of perception, and he comes up with what is now known as an emanation theory of perception. And the way it works is this, according to him. So again, he's trying to explain how is it that you see stuff, hear stuff, taste stuff, etc. And his claim is that atoms fly off from the objects and impact our sense organs. So they're like blasting us. So then what happens is this impact is then transmitted to the atoms that make up the soul, and then the perceiver, and like for example, you hearing this and seeing the video, the experience is the image of the original object. Kind of one crude way to look at it is that there's like you can almost picture like something like like a version of the thing like flying off it towards a thing, and like like in a cartoon, bumping into it. So you're being like hit with the kind of like a phantom or a shadow of my voice, or a phantom of the the video or my appearance. Now, since these experiences are produced by a combination of objective material qualities of objects and the subjective effect on the impact of atoms, he takes the view that sense experience is thus subjective, because while he thought that the atoms flying from the objects impacting you is objective, literally to put they're objects, your experience of it is subjective. And so he comes to the conclusion that sense experience is subjective. You don't experience the real qualities of objects, you just experience your experience of them. Again, this later becomes presented as the primary-secondary quality distinction, and taste is usually a standard example of this, or warmth or cold. So there's no like yumminess in pancakes. Like you couldn't take like a pancake or a waffle and analyze and say, it has 3.4 grams of pure yum. The yum is in in the mind of the yummer. Likewise, like yuckiness is in the mind of the yucker. So like if you analyze something that's you don't like, you're not going to be able to find in it yuck. And if you like something, find it at yum, you can find the chemicals, the composition, etc. But the yuck and yum is in our minds. And again, this later gets developed as primary-secondary quality distinction by people like Galileo, and it was all the rage during the modern era. In terms of the types of knowledge, he comes up with the idea of two types of knowledge. So in order to know the truth, according to him, we have to have our reason go beyond our senses, because he infers, given like the stuff we experience is just atoms smacking into us, the senses only give us the appearance of things. And so we need reason. But he also claims that reason has no material to work with beyond what we get from the senses. So reason's got to process the senses. And to like a supposed quote for him is, "Wretched mind, do you take your evidence from us and then throw us down? That throw is your overthrow." Very dramatic. In reality, he claims we know nothing, for the truth is in the depths. So lots of poetry there. Now he does divide knowledge into true-born and hopefully YouTube won't ban the video for this, but let's call it sense experience. We'll call it the B, because I'm not sure like how YouTube handles such things. I know they allow horrible things, but I don't know what they allow for language. And again, anyways. So the true-born is objective, it's things as they are, and it's atoms in the void, the truth of things. And then the sense experience is subjective, things as they appear, and these are qualities, colors, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures. And again, so we see in terms of like, why is this important? We see here the foundations being laid for the primary-secondary distinction, which is there's the world that is and the world we experience. And this was developed much more extensively during the modern era. If you take the modern philosophy class, see a lot of that. And it's pretty much still the default in science today. I mean, you're more refined with like, neuroscience and chemicals and stuff. But the basic idea remains the same, that there's the world that's out there, the true physical world of physics and chemistry, etc. And then there's what we experience, subjectively, that warmth and cold and taste are all in our minds or our brains, and then the rest is out there. So that takes us to the end of Democritus's epistemology. And in the future, we'll pick back up with Democritus and the Atomists, and then head into some more stuff. Hopefully back in person. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.